Biden was on the beach while those people were suffering. He was asked about it. He said no comment. Are you kidding me? As somebody that's handled disasters in Florida, you got to be activated. You've got to be there. You've got to be present. You've got to be helping people who are doing this.
This is impressively not answering the question. What? What does this have to do with, is climate change caused by humans? That was the question.
And here's the deal.
Let's just answer the question.
So, is that a yes or is that a yes? Is that a hand raise?
You do not.
I think it was a hand raise for him, and it's my hands are in my pockets.
No, I didn't raise a hand.
Wait, did he just say climate change is a hoax? Oh, dude. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beccasphere, where we talk about climate change and the clean energy transition. If those are important voting issues for you, then consider clicking the subscribe button below and ringing the bell so you don't miss every single time I post. Today we are going to cover the first GOP debate, climate and clean energy takes. Why have I chosen to subject myself to this, you might ask? Because they might be relevant. Some more than others probably, but you know, I think it's important to see how this party has chosen to situate themselves amongst their voter base in the way of these different opinions. Speaking of which, I thought we would start by looking at a Twitch stream clip that I did, because if you're on Twitch and you didn't know, I Twitch stream on Tuesdays and Fridays from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. You should join me. So yeah, I actually already covered it. So here is that clip about Americans' general views on climate change. I was very curious about this because I know that it's gotten more and more divided in the recent years. But how do Americans feel about climate change? And what steps do they think the United States should take to address it? Here are 8 charts that illustrate Americans' views on the issue based on a recent Pew Research Center survey. All they need to do is just acknowledge there's a gigacrap ton of profit to be made from new climate-friendly technology. Facts. Clean energy technology, plentiful when it comes to innovation. Come on, guys. 1. A majority of Americans support prioritizing the development of renewable energy sources. 2/3 of U.S. adults say the country should prioritize developing renewable energy sources, such as wind and solar, over expanding the production of oil, coal, and natural gas, according to a survey conducted in June 2023. 9 in 10 Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents say the U.S. should prioritize developing alternative energy sources to address America's energy supply. Among Republicans and Republican leaners, 42% support developing alternative energy sources, while 58% say the country should prioritize expanding exploration and production of oil, coal, and natural gas. Yikes. Yeah, that's still very, very, very split. There are important differences by age within the GOP. 2/3 of Republicans under 30, 67% prioritize the development of alternative energy sources. By contrast, 75% of Republicans ages 65 and older prioritize expanding the production of oil, coal, and natural gas. 2. Americans are reluctant to phase out fossil fuels altogether, but younger adults are more open to it. Overall, about 3 in 10 adults say that the U.S. should completely phase out oil, coal, and natural gas. More than twice as many, 68%, say the country should use a mix of energy sources, including fossil fuels and renewables. We have some work to do, guys. While the public is generally reluctant to phase out fossil fuels altogether, younger adults are more supportive of this idea. Among Americans ages 18 to 29, 48% say the U.S. should exclusively use renewables, compared with 52% that say the U.S. should use a mix of energy sources, including fossil fuels. 3. The public supports the federal government incentivizing wind and solar energy production. In many sectors, including energy and transportation, federal incentives and regulations significantly influence investment and development. 2/3 of Americans think the federal government should encourage domestic production of wind and solar power. Just 7% say that the government should discourage it, while 26% think it should neither be encouraged or discouraged. I'm sure there's also some people in this category, the free market advocates, that say that wind and solar are already doing so good they don't need any more help, right? Views are more mixed on how the federal government should approach other activities that would reduce carbon emissions. On balance, more Americans think the government should encourage than discourage the use of electric vehicles and nuclear power production. Ooh, what does it say on nuclear power, actually? Okay, encourage Okay, I think this is really valuable because, you know, particularly conservatives are like, we never talk about nuclear. Everybody on the left is so against nuclear. And that's not true. A lot of people just don't know what to think about it. People aren't necessarily against it, and that's good. When it comes to oil and gas drilling, Americans' views are also closely divided. 34% think the government should encourage drilling, while 30% say it should discourage it, and 35% say it should do neither. Coal mining is one activity included in the survey where public sentiment is negative on balance. 4. Americans see room for multiple actors, including corporations and federal government, to do more to address the impacts of climate change. 2/3 of adults say that large businesses and corporations are doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change. Far fewer say they are doing about the right amount or too much. Okay, good. Americans are on the money with this one. They are doing far too little. It's true. Majority also say that their state elected officials and energy industry are doing too little to address climate change, according to a March 2023 survey. Also on the money with that. Okay, so most having to do with corporations, which is very interesting because I think that personally kind of goes against the whole argument that free market's going to solve everything. Because if they thought the free market was going to solve everything, then they would have a lot more confidence in those corporations and businesses to do the right amount of things. Right? I'm just saying. But that being said, it's not that much different than elected officials. I think it's also very interesting that more people think that ordinary Americans are doing too little than energy industry. I would agree that local community is probably doing more than these guys and than everybody else, but also ordinary Americans are part of your local community, so interesting. People assume that their fellow Americans are doing less than they are. That's interesting. And environmental advocacy organizations are doing about the right amount. Okay, fair enough. And the federal government is doing far too little. And they're potentially doing more than state, which is interesting. 5. Democrats and Republicans have grown farther apart over the last decade in their assessment of the threat posed by climate change. I wonder if it has anything to do with the elected officials and media coverage on either side. Overall, the majority of Americans, 54%, describe climate change as a major threat to the country's well-being. This share is down slightly from 2020, but remains higher than in the early 2010s. Nearly 8 in 10 Democrats describe climate change as a major threat to the country's well-being, up from 6 in 10 a decade ago. By contrast, 1 in 4 Republicans consider climate change a major threat, a share almost identical to 10 years ago. Concern over climate change has risen internationally, as shown by separate Pew Research Center polling across 19 countries in 2022. People in many advanced economies express higher levels of concern than Americans. For instance, 81% of French adults and 73% of Germans describe climate change as a major threat. 6. Climate change is a low priority for Americans than other national issues. While a majority of Americans view climate change as a major threat, it is a low priority than issues such as strengthening the economy and reducing healthcare costs, which makes me sad because one of the best ways to strengthen the economy is to avoid climate disruption. Strengthening the economy is such a BS data point. The economy strengthens when you deal with all the other lower priority issues. Right? Dude, yeah, exactly. That's Our analysis found that partisan gaps in climate change are often the widest in questions such as this one that measures the salience or importance of the issue. The gaps are most modest when it comes to some specific climate policies. For example, the majority of Republicans and Democrats alike say that they would favor a proposal that would provide a tax credit to businesses for developing technologies for carbon capture and storage. The perception of local climate impacts vary by Americans' political affiliation and whether they believe that climate change is a serious problem. A majority of Americans say that global climate change is affecting their local community either a great deal or some. About 4 in 10 see little or no impact on their own community. The perception that the effects of climate change are happening close to home is one factor that could drive political or public concern and calls for action on the issue, but perceptions are tied more strongly to people's beliefs about climate change and their partisan affiliation than to local conditions. That's very interesting. One of our hopes was that the more serious it got, the more concern people would have, but maybe that's not true, and that's unfortunate. That's because they don't connect extreme event to climate change. About 3/4 of Americans support U.S. participation in international efforts to reduce the effects of climate change. Americans offer broad support for international engagement on climate change. 74% say they support U.S. participation in international efforts to reduce the effects of climate change. Yeah, because they want to tell China and India to do it. Still, there's little consensus on how current U.S. efforts stack up against those of other large economies. About 1 in 3 Americans think the U.S. is doing more than other economies to reduce the effects of global climate change, while 30% say the U.S. is doing less than other economies, and 32% think it's doing about as much as others. When asked what they think the right balance of responsibility is, the majority of Americans say the U.S. should do about as much as other large economies to reduce the effects of climate change, while 27% think it should do more than others. A previous Center survey found that while Americans favor international cooperation on climate change in general terms, their support has its limits. In January 2022, 59% of Americans say that the U.S. does not have a responsibility to provide financial assistance. Why are we like this? To developing countries to help them build renewable energy sources. I'm curious if this number would be lower for loss and damages. Probably maybe a teeny bit, maybe. Like maybe we're like, okay, we'll pay for the fact that we helped screw up the planet, but we won't help you transition. I don't know. So as you can see, Republicans definitely seem to not care as much about climate change or clean energy, but they still kind of do. Mostly they support clean energy, and the younger the Republican, which should be the audience that these candidates are trying to reach, right? You're trying to get the young people to vote, care more about these issues than the older ones. So with all that being said, let's now dive into this debate and see what these candidates' climate change and clean energy takes are.
We need to lower your gas prices. We're going to open up all energy production. We will be energy dominant again in this country.
Okay, first of all, we're not going to act like there's no international reasons why there might be inflation in this country. Of course, you know, we are coming out of a pandemic and there's a war between Russia and Ukraine that are happening right now. And of course, Russia is a huge fossil fuel producer and exporter. And as a result, the international gas prices have gone up. So how much that has to do with Biden, give or take. But all of that has led to fossil fuel companies making record profits off the fact that you cannot afford gas. The weird thing about the fossil fuel industry, and I know this is going to sound conspiratorial, but like, there's so many bad conspiracies out here. Why can't we believe one that's actually true? So fossil fuel companies are very organized, all right? They are very monopolistic. When one of them increases prices, the prices go up for pretty much all the other companies, okay? They kind of work together in a cartel called OPEC. And so they all chose to rise the price of gas. And as a result, the shareholders for those fossil fuel companies made record profits during the pandemic. So is that Bidenomics? Not really. That's more just, you know, the fossil fuel industry being assholes. Even if you were to give more land to fossil fuel companies to explore more, they're not going to increase the supply because they like the prices with keeping the supply low. Additionally, they are actually sitting on a ton of land already. So the amount of land that they could drill on but are actually just deciding not to is staggering. All right. One of my favorite videos is Senator Katie Porter pulling up in her minivan and opening the trunk to show all the bags of rices that represent the amount of acreage that fossil fuel companies are sitting on. It's ridiculous.
Mr. Summers, do you recognize the following statement? Banning federal leasing and development on federal lands and waters would derail decades of U.S. energy progress.
I do, Congresswoman.
That's your statement. How many of the Department of Interior's approved and ready to drill permits are currently unused?
Congresswoman, it takes a long time to develop these leases that
I appreciate that, Mr. Summers. I'm just asking how many permits are unused?
Congresswoman, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding as to how these
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Summers, there are 7,700 permits unused. How many acres of public land are already leased by fossil fuel companies and not even used yet, just available for drilling whenever you decide?
Congresswoman, again, I think you have a fundamental misunderstanding as to how this process works and the time and resources.
Reclaiming my time. The answer is 13.9 million acres. To visualize how much land that is, if each grain of rice were 1 acre, that would be 450 279 pounds of rice. The American Petroleum Institute even opposed pausing more leasing on our lands. They even sued to stop it because apparently this acreage wasn't enough.
But bottom line, opening up the different, fossil fuel reserves to decrease prices, it wouldn't happen, and it wouldn't happen as fast as they kind of are insinuating that it would happen, right? We're not going to, if you even snapped your fingers and gave fossil fuels all this more land, it's still going to take like at least 5 years for you to see anything back because it takes time for them to build those different sites. It's not a realistic ask, even if we wanted to move with fossil fuels, which we shouldn't because they're really bad for human health. So it doesn't really sound like a good idea to open up all these different energy reserves. And the concept, the term of opening up new energy reserves is way oversimplified, to say the least.
I'm incredibly proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration. I mean, in 4 short years, we rebuilt our military. We revived our economy. We unleashed American energy.
I think the New York Times fact-checked this one. We unleashed American energy. The Trump administration did export more crude and refined products than it imported. But under President Donald J. Trump and Mr. Pence, the U.S. continued to import millions of barrels of oil a day. Joseph R. Biden Jr. campaigned on a promise to end new oil and gas leases on public lands and waters, but in the first 2 years of his administration, Mr. Biden approved more federal drilling permits than at the same point in the Trump administration. Yeah, so that looks bad on everybody I just mentioned. Even though it was actually Biden's goal to end new oil and gas leases, he's supposed to be the climate president, he actually has been worse than Trump when it comes to that, all in the name of helping to satiate the needs of Republicans and Joe Manchin. He had to make some promises for Manchin to sign the Inflation Reduction Act, which ended up still being the largest climate bill in U.S. history, but noticeably only has carrots for clean energy and no sticks for fossil fuels. So unleashing American energy, that's a fun phrase to use. It means nothing.
Yeah, this isn't that complicated, guys. Unlock American energy, drill, frack, burn coal, embrace nuclear. Put people back to work.
Okay, so this man is very pro fossil fuels, very clearly. And it's funny that he mentioned the jobs thing right after, because actually it's been shown that clean energy produces more jobs than fossil fuels and already has for the past few years. But besides that, I'm very interested why Republicans love nuclear so much. Because nuclear is a good option. Nuclear is fine. Out of the other options, that's the only one that I would be comfortable with still continuing into the future. It just, we would probably want to work on the newer technologies, creating a actual uniform patent for construction to decrease costs and time it takes to do it and figure out the nuclear waste issue. But, there's a lot of cool technology in that field. I don't genuinely know why Republicans like that one. If you know, down and below, let me know in the comments. But yeah, no, we definitely do not want to continue fracking and drilling and burning coal and all that kind of stuff, because that has been shown to heavily reduce human health in that area, the environment in that area, and all of those things actually cost more than clean energy for consumers. So it just actually doesn't make sense. We will be able to supply all of our needs on wind, solar, battery storage, nuclear, hydropower, pumped hydro, all that kind of stuff. There's so many different technologies for energy storage nowadays that don't necessarily require lithium or critical minerals. So it seems very reductive to me. And it kind of seems like there might be some personal attachment that he has with those energy sources. I don't know. You should continue watching this video to see if I'm going to talk about that more.
On this, we're missing something. We can't just talk about the Biden economy, because the economy, energy, and national security are all tied together.
That is so true, which is why it is important that you subscribe to this channel. But I feel like we're not going to agree on the exact mix of energy that he's referring to. Let's see.
Of course, we're paying too much for our energy in our state, in our country right now. But part of the reason why is because of the Biden policies on energy. We've got a plan right now, the $1.2 trillion of Green New Deal spending buried in the Inflation Creation Act is something that is just subsidizing China. If we're going to stop buying oil from the Middle East and start buying batteries from China, we're just trading OPEC for Sinopec.
So that's actually a very common misconception, that we're just moving from the Middle East and Russia to China, because China owns a lot of the clean energy technology that we would need to purchase from them. But here's the key difference. You need a constant stream of fossil fuels. Clean energy technology, such as batteries and wind and solar, which in their case, they mostly controlled the solar market and a decent amount of the battery market too. Specifically the lithium side of the battery market anyways. The difference is that technology, once you purchase it, can be used for 20 years. It doesn't need a constant flow. And we still need to develop a recycling industry, because we can't keep mining for critical minerals constantly. It's bad for the environment, it's bad for the countries that are involved. So we actually do need to develop a robust recycling system. Now, the US already dropped the ball when it comes to having control over the clean energy system. We could have. We were some of the first people to invent solar panels. But then the technology became more elevated in Germany, and then China bought the patents needed to really mass produce them and heavily subsidize it down, as China does. So we dropped the ball on that. But we don't necessarily have to drop the ball on repairing, recycling the technology, so that it doesn't need to be first purchased every single time. And when we do that, which will boost domestic jobs, because recycling is a big job, then we will actually not have as much dependence on China. All that to be said, though, even when it comes to the primary products, that is a concern that countries are seriously looking at right now. The US and Australia already formed an alliance to try to reduce China's piece of the pie when it comes to those technologies. So that's something that the US is already very aware of, and from a national security standpoint, it isn't pretty. And we don't want to go down the same path that we did with fossil fuels, which we would continue to have if we continued fossil fuels, because that's the way it's been. Do you want to go back to being dependent on the Middle East and Russia? Like, we have an option to actually be pretty domestically independent, because again, we're only purchasing these items once every 20 years, and supply ourselves on our own resources.
And then belatedly, the Biden administration says, no, we're going to put sanctions on Russian oil. Well, we put sanctions on Russian oil. Well, then it's 20% off. Who's buying it? China. So if you buy a battery in this country, you buy a solar panel, it's being produced in a plant in China powered by coal, or it's being powered by oil and gas at 20% off. And every farmer in this country would like to buy diesel at 20% off, just like they're buying it in China.
So that's another argument that I hear often, which is because we use fossil fuels to make clean energy, what's the point? We should just be using those fossil fuels instead. To which I say, you're still reducing how much fossil fuel you use. And then when the percent of energy in the energy pool increases, then you will no longer be able to say that we're using fossil fuels to make those products. And also, slight dig on China, which again represented over half of the clean energy development in the world. Yes, they are also a big coal user, but they are also moving on clean energy too, and once they get their transmission lines figured out, which is the same problem that we have, then their percentage of clean energy is going to go up substantially.
More than 1,000 people are still unaccounted for in Maui after the deadliest U.S. wildfire in more than a century. Hawaii's governor and White House officials said that climate change amplified the cost of human error.
And a tropical storm hit California for the first time in 84 years. The ocean hit 101 degrees off the coast of Florida. And in the last month, the heat wave in the Southwest broke records nearly 50 years old.
So Alexander Diaz from Young America's Foundation has a question for you all.
Polls consistently show that young people's #1 issue is climate change. How will you, as both President of the United States and leader of the Republican Party, calm their fears that the Republican Party doesn't care about climate change?
So we want to start on this with a show of hands. Do you believe in human behavior is causing climate change.
First of all, climate change is part of the Republican debate. I am shooketh and glad. When I was first asking people, like, what was in the debate, my first question was, what were their conversations with energy? I didn't even bother asking if they had opinions on climate change because I didn't even expect that to be a question. So the fact that it's a question in the lowest bar is down to the floor, that's good. They're talking about it. Now let's see how many people actually think climate change is a problem.
Your hand if you do.
Look, we're not school children. Let's have the debate. I mean, I'm happy to take it to start. Alexander,
So do you want to raise your hand or not?
Oh, look at you, macho man. You're going to take it to the park. Come on, come on. Let's fight you, climate change. What is this? This is something that is 97 to 99% agreed upon. And the only people that don't agree upon it are the ones that end up on PragerU and Daily Wire. Like, why are we having this conversation like it's a debate? Come on, this is something that, like, first graders know. Like, it's not hard, okay? Like, why are we still acting like this is a debate? Ron, this is embarrassing, Ron.
So let me just say to Alexander this. First of all, one of the reasons our country's decline is because of the way the corporate media treats Republicans versus Democrats. Biden was on the beach while those people were suffering. He was asked about it. He said, no comment. Are you kidding me? As somebody that's handled disasters in Florida, you got to be activated. You've got to be there. You've got to be present. You've got to be helping people who are doing this.
This is impressively not answering the question. What? What does this have to do with, is climate change caused by humans? That was the question.
And here's the deal.
Let's just answer the question.
So is that a yes or is that a yes? Is that a hand raise?
You do not.
I think it was a hand raise for him, and it's my hands are in my pockets.
No,
because
no,
the
I
climate
didn't
change agenda is
raise a hand.
Wait, did he just say climate change is a hoax? Oh, dude.
Let us be honest as Republicans. I'm the only person on the stage who isn't bought and paid for, so I can say this. The climate change agenda is a hoax.
This one was one of the clips that I saw. I'm the only one that's not bought and paid for. Okay, run clip from Twitch stream. How Vivek Ramaswamy makes money from climate denial. At Wednesday's debate, Ramaswamy said he was the only candidate who's not bought and paid for. That couldn't be further than the truth. Vivek Ramaswamy calls climate change a religion. He also co-founded a fossil fuel investment fund focused on pushing for more drilling. Ramaswamy's push to end climate-conscious investing. Over the years, Ramaswamy has been known for many things. Recently, he's become best known as the right's most prominent crusader against climate-conscious investing. His latest mission, ensure Republican-led states put their money in big investment firms like BlackRock that are trying, or at least claiming, to make more climate-friendly decisions, and reallocating that money to his firm, Strive Asset Management, which explicitly promises to not invest with the climate in mind. The fossil fuel industry has wanted someone to do this for many years. As we previously reported, the anti-ESG movement, which pushes corporations to reject environmentally and socially conscious investing principles, was originally created by the fossil fuel industry operatives to try to delay the renewable energy transition. The movement fizzled in the early 2000s, but is revived in 2022 when Ramaswamy launched Strive with the help of billionaire investor Peter Thiel and Bill Ackman, as well as the same fossil fuel industry connected group that spearheaded the original movement. Ramaswamy has reported more than $50 million in holding in Strive, which to date is mostly a fund to promote fossil fuel development. As Semaphore reports, the largest fund at Strive, called Drill, invests in U.S. energy companies and urges them to keep drilling for oil as long as it's profitable. Though Semaphore describes Drill's holding as energy, the vast majority are fossil fuels. According to Strive's own description, 93.6% of Drill's investments are oil, gas, and pipeline companies. These companies rank among the world's top climate polluters. But yes, he has no ties to fossil fuel funding at all.
I'm the only person on the stage who isn't bought and paid for, so I can say this.
Yeah, that's embarrassing. That's really embarrassing. Okay.
The reality is, the anti-carbon agenda is the wet blanket on our economy. And
Anti-carbon agenda. Oh, that's a fun one.
And so the reality is, more people are dying of bad climate change policies than they are of actual climate change.
I'm sorry, sir. I'm going to need a source. What? How do you even quantify that? Would that be people that died from wind turbine installations? Are we talking about like power outages that are caused by wind and solar, even though they represent a minuscule amount of the energy that we use? How does that work? That's like when the Texas freeze happened and everybody was like, oh, it's those pesky wind turbines. And then it turned out it was a combination of multiple different factors, including the fact that the natural gas infrastructure froze. And yeah, the wind turbines didn't work, but that's not because wind turbines can't work in the snow, in the cold. They can. They work on the poles, but they just didn't weatherize them to be able to work in the cold because they were like, oh, look at us for Texas, we're not going to get this storm. So if we're talking about people that have died from power outages, well, fossil fuels represent way more of the energy portfolio, so I think that would still be on the fossil fuels. Or, you know, the power utility companies, I guess. But that has nothing to do with clean energy. Now if we're talking about how many people have died from black lung disease, from air pollution, water pollution, oil spills, explosions, climate change induced extreme weather events. Now we have a death toll.
First of all, we do care about clean air, clean water. We want to see that taken care of, but there's a right way to do it. And the right way to do it is, first of all, yes, is climate change real? Yes, it is. But if you want to go and really change the environment, then we need to start telling China and India that they have to lower their emissions.
Okay. We have a slightly more realistic response. I'm actually kind of impressed that we've gone this far, which again means my expectations for this debate have sunk down to Hades. So let's talk about this though. That's another very common argument that any person that does not think we should move on climate change, which is not just Republicans, but it's a lot of them, have to usually make, is that, well, why would America do anything about it if China and India aren't doing anything about it? Well, let's look at China and India. So again, as I said before, China actually represented over half of the clean energy development in the world last year. They are also, again, the main exporters of clean energy goods. And they also are the manufacturer of the world. So when we're talking about everything that's made in China that comes over to the US, that's kind of the emissions that the US should represent, frankly. Okay? So if we move the emissions back to the supply chain, back to the demand source, then actually the US has a lot more emissions to account for than we would normally think. Actually, when we talk about it, the emissions per capita per person of the United States is way higher than China, which means we are causing way more emissions for just being able to supply our own population, which might say something about our consumption rate, might say something about our inefficiency of energy, might have something to say about our car-centric nature. You know what I mean? So not exactly apples to apples comparison. Also, we have to consider the fact that we are talking about current emissions, and there's this thing called historic emissions, because carbon emissions, whether or not we're talking about methane or carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide, last in the atmosphere for a certain amount of time. For methane, it's about 10 years or so. So that is why it's one of the quickest ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is to reduce our methane emissions. But carbon dioxide can last in the atmosphere for several hundred years. And so the emissions that the United States put up into there as being the historical largest emitter is still impacting us today. So yeah, we can point to China and India, who are the current largest and third largest emitters, to do more, but to be honest, they actually are doing more, and they historically are not the highest emitter. That's us. We represent about 1/5 of climate change impact. That's not a small amount at all. Also, India actually recently chose to prioritize battery storage over coal for the next 5 years. So that's something that we definitely can't say we would do.
And these green subsidies that Biden has put in, all he's done is help China.
Ooh, let's talk about subsidies. Let's talk about subsidies. How fossil fuel subsidies are hurting the energy transition. An analysis from the International Institute of Sustainable Development shows that G20 governments provided a record $1.4 trillion to subsidize climate heating fossil fuels in 2022. This came despite the fact that those same nations committed in 2009 to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Moreover, in 2022, they gave more than double the amount of fossil fuel subsidies than in 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic. Funding that could have helped bridge the gap in funding the clean energy transition, the IISD said in an August report. Another new paper from the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, said that adding in the cost of environmental damage from fossil fuels, including climate change and local air pollution deaths, which it calls implicit subsidies, pushed up the overall value of fossil fuel subsidies to $7 trillion in 2022, equal to about 7% of global GDP. According to the IISD report, the 2022 rise in subsidies was driven mainly by governments dramatically expanding support to help consumers deal with peaking fossil fuel prices after Russia invaded Ukraine in February that year. Boy, fossil fuel companies really controlled that whole situation. G20 governments spent nearly $1 trillion in fossil energy subsidies for consumers in 2022, almost 6 times the $168 billion provided in 2021, it noted. Around 1/3, or about $440 billion of that total $1.4 trillion in subsidies flowed into new fossil fuel production, including some $322 billion in investments by state-owned enterprises and $50 billion from public financial institutions. These subsidies from the public purse hurt global climate action by perpetuating the world's reliance on fossil fuels, incentivizing greenhouse gas emissions, and undermining the cost competitiveness of clean energy, the report said. So fossil fuels received $1.4 trillion in subsidies, and wind and solar only got a measly $380 billion. Subsidies, huh? Sounds like a problem, sounds like something we should fix, but maybe let's start on the fossil fuel side. It's the most irritating thing when people compare fossil fuels and clean energy as if they've had the exact same amount of support and the same amount of time to mature. They haven't.
Half of the batteries for electric vehicles are made in China. And so that's not helping the environment. You're putting money in China's pocket, and Biden did that. So first of all, I think we need to acknowledge the truth, which is these subsidies are not working. We also need to take on the international world and say, okay, India and China, you've got to stop polluting, and that's when we'll start to deal with
Senator Scott, are you bought and paid for?
So another thing is that we also don't necessarily have to prioritize electric vehicles. We could prioritize walkable cities and clean transportation. And I know walkable cities is a conspiratorial lightning rod right now, but it's literally just being close to your basic needs and not have to drive 20 minutes in traffic to those needs. I don't really know why that's controversial, but okay. But also we are prioritizing cars because the automobile industry got us way back in the day when it came to first building our own infrastructure. So if we're going to use electric vehicles, we should probably prioritize putting some more of the domestic supply in the US, and that's why the electric vehicle subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act requires that. Otherwise you can't get those subsidies. So we did that. Also, why are we waiting to do anything about climate change domestically until other countries do something about it? Why wouldn't the other countries do the exact same thing then? That doesn't make any sense. That's still a non-answer to actually dealing with climate change. And that's the part where my audio decided that I had spoken enough for that day. But bottom line, as you can probably imagine, my results of this GOP debate would be that there is still no Republican candidate that takes climate change seriously.
It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
I guess we will just have to keep on hoping that the other party will someday take things seriously. But what did you think about the GOP debate? What were the most infuriating takes that you heard? And what did you think of my commentary of it? Let me know all your thoughts down in the comment section below. And until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news organizations. Thank you so much to the people on Patreon who help support me and my fur baby Rue. A special shout out to the climate confident and courageous David H., Norman Anal, Greg H., Paul B., Phil Plasma, Dan Morton, Nate, Specker, Bree C., Climate Teacher John J., Deanne, Steve, Kevin Morton, and SKP Joe Korskold. I greatly appreciate your support of $5 or more. If you would like to support the Beckosphere, please check out the Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links in the description below for reoccurring or one-time payments. Bye for now.